Okay, welcome everyone to today's Google Webmaster Central Office Hours Hangouts. My name is John Mueller. I'm a Webmaster Trends Analyst here at Google in Switzerland. And part of what I do is talk with webmasters and publishers like you all, like some of those here in the Hangout, I guess. Some of you may be watching this somewhere else. For today, I picked a topic that comes up every now and then. I thought it would be useful to do a brief presentation about it and to kind of focus on it for the questions. I see some of the questions are focusing on it, but I might have scared people away with the questions, with the topic, in that there are not that many questions yet. So there's also a chance for you to kind of get your questions in. But before we get started, if any of you new folks here in the Hangout have any questions, feel free to ask right now. No?
I have a question.
All right.
So, can you tell us more about the new Google bot, the mobile bot?
It's the same bot, but it just got a new iPhone, so I guess that's what changed.
So that's pretty much it, yeah?
Pretty much it. So if you use the testing tools, you'll have the new resolution. It'll use the new settings to kind of crawl for mobile-friendly pages. But other than that, it's essentially the same as before.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let me find my presentation. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions along the way, if you want to add something. I'm sure there's some aspects that I missed, but I hope this gives you some insight into robots text and how it works, what it does, what to kind of watch out for. All right, so this is my brief guide. So basically, I think the most important aspect of the robots text is that you don't really need one in most cases. So if you have a new website and you don't really know what to do with the robots text file, chances are you probably don't need to do anything there. Either it'll be set up automatically by whatever system you're using, or you can even live without one at all. The robots text file is used by well-behaved search engines like Google. There are, of course, other search engines that follow this as well. And it essentially tells them where they can and they can't crawl. So when they go through your website, they click on individual pages, follow all the links on those pages, and if any of those links is blocked by robots text, then it won't actually look at that content. Thing to keep in mind with regards to blocking crawling, this is something that's often confused in that blocking crawling isn't really a security mechanism. It doesn't replace a password. It doesn't really replace server-side security. It doesn't replace the need for you to keep your system up to date. So it's essentially just a mechanism that tells search engines that they shouldn't crawl here. It also doesn't prevent indexing of the URL. So just because a page is blocked from crawling doesn't mean a search engine won't be able to pick that up for indexing. It essentially doesn't know if there's anything there, but it could still show that in search if it thinks, well, very likely there's something here that the user might want to see, but I'm not allowed to take a look at it myself. Also, it doesn't fix canonicalization. So if you have an issue with www or non-www or anything else where you have different URLs for the same content, the robots text file isn't the place to fix that. What it does do is prevent crawling, of course. So if your server isn't able to handle a lot of requests to a specific part of your site, that's one good reason to use robots text. So with about the indexing part, since that's another aspect that's often confused, we can index a URL without ever looking at the content. We might notice that there are lots of links pointing to a URL. We'll see an anchor text with those links and think, there's probably something here that we would want to show in search, but we don't really know what it is. So it can still be indexed alone without the content. It can still show up in rankings. You can still find it with a site query if you're specifically searching for that. And usually what you'll see is the title, kind of based on the anchors that we found, the URL, of course, but we don't have a snippet because we can't look at that URL. So we'll show something like description isn't available because the site prevents us from actually looking at it. So often we'll hear about people who want to find example robots text files so that they can copy and paste it to their own server because they think this is important. And like I mentioned before, you don't really need one. And if your system, your CMS is set up already, you don't really need to change anything there in most cases. If you do want to look at another person's site's robots text file, you just take the domain name and add robots text, and you'll see what they're using. But again, I strongly recommend not copy and pasting other people's files because your site is likely very different from theirs. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail here. If you want to look at the documentation for this, you can search for controlling crawling, and it'll bring up the developersgoogle.com page on controlling crawling and indexing, where you have all of the technical details laid out. All right, so the first step when you do have a robots text file and you do want to have it used is it needs to be readable. So the robots text file is the first thing we look at whenever we try to crawl a website. Before we actually look at the home page, we'll double check that we're allowed to look at that home page. We usually check that maybe once a day, sometimes a little bit more often. And we'll crawl a number of pages during that time. So we'll look at it once in the morning, crawl a bunch of stuff during the day, and look at it the next day to see if it changed. That means if you need to make any urgent changes in the robots text file, we might not notice until we look at it again, which might be a day later. There's a tip coming up on how you can speed that up, though. We look at it on a per host and per protocol level, but not per directory. So if you're hosting your website under example.com/mywebsite/ in that directory, then we won't look at the robots text file in that directory, but rather the one that's directly on example.com. If you don't give us a clear response to our request for the robots text file, we won't crawl at all. So if there's a server error, or if there's a timeout, if we can't reach the server at all, if you're telling us that you're not allowed to look at this file, then all of these things tell us that we don't know where we are. We aren't able to crawl, so we're not going to crawl at all. We'll stay on the safe side. And as far as I know, most search engines handle it like this. But this is kind of something to watch out for when your site isn't being crawled at all. Maybe your robots text file is blocked in a way that prevents us from actually looking at it. We will crawl if it's a 200 response code, or if it's a clear response code that says this file doesn't exist. And if there's a clear response code that this file doesn't exist, then we'll assume that there are no restrictions at all on the crawling. In general, robots text file is a simple text file. You can open it up in a text editor. You shouldn't use a word processor for it, but any normal text file editor should work. It has different sections in it. So they're usually separated with a user agent section, where you have user agent that says this is for this search engine or this crawler, some user agent name that you specify. Then you have any number of disallow lines, so disallow colon, and some path that's not allowed for crawling. And you might have allow directives as well, where you say maybe disallow, don't crawl here, but allow crawling in some exception that's within that section. So you can kind of add several layers of allow and disallow in there, and sometimes that makes it harder to read and to understand what actually is being blocked here. And finally, you can have a sitemap listing where you say, for this website, I have a sitemap file here. This is, of course, totally optional as well, but it helps us to crawl and index all of the changes on your website a little bit faster.
And John, just regarding crawling, you don't crawl all the pages, right? So if I have, let's say, 2,000 pages on my website, you would only crawl, like, let's say, 1,900 of them. Are you going to get into that later as well?
So we try to crawl as much as possible from a website, and sometimes we'll crawl all of them, but it's never guaranteed. So we'll try to get to everything that we can, but we can't really guarantee that we'll be able to make it to everything. So it would be completely normal if only 1,900 of those pages were actually crawled and indexed. It could also be normal that all 2,000 of them are indexed.
So even if I fetch it, it's not going to help.
It's not guaranteed, let's put it that way. So it does help us to understand that there's something here, but if our systems say, well, this website isn't really worth spending its time on, then that can happen, that we'll say, well, we've seen this URL, but we've noticed it hasn't changed, or it looks like an empty page, or it's not really interesting, or it's a calendar page that we've seen up until the year 99 million. And those are all kinds of pages that we can find, but we don't necessarily index them separately. So, yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
All right. With regards to like the lines that you have here with the allow and disallow and user agent, since you can have multiple of these sections, it's important to try to figure out which one is relevant. So for the user agent section, we have kind of the rule that the more specific user agent trumps the less specific one. So if you have something, a user agent that finds a really good match there, then it'll follow only that section and it'll ignore everything else. So if you have a section that's for all other user agents, then we see that as being for other user agents, not for the one that's matched. Similar with the allow and disallow line, we look at the best matching line and we ignore the rest. Sitemap mentions, as I mentioned before, can be in there as well. You can also link to sitemaps on other domains. And these sitemaps apply to all user agents. They're not specific to individual ones. So if we look at kind of a question, let me just mute you for a second. So this is an example robots text file I made up. We have one section here for essentially all other user agents, so with the asterisks, and they're not allowed to crawl anything with chicken. Googlebot is not allowed to crawl anything with mouse, except for this section, mouse for computer, for example. And a more specific kind of Googlebot, the interstellar Googlebot, isn't allowed to crawl anything on Pluto and not allowed to go to Europa. And the sitemap line here looks like it kind of belongs to this section here, but it's actually generic for all crawlers that go to this website. So in this case, if maybe Googlebot for image search were to come along to this website, it would go through here and see, well, this Googlebot interstellar doesn't match. This Googlebot line looks like a good match, and this asterisk line would also match. But the Googlebot line here is the most specific one that matches Googlebot for image search. So it would only use this section. So anything that's here maybe in the chicken section of the website, that could still be crawled because it's not explicitly disallowed in the section for Googlebot here.
So John, basically more specific user agents do not inherit less specific directives, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So if you have a set of URLs or folders that you want to block for all user agents, and you have some specific rules there, then you have to copy that set of directives to the more specific set as well. Okay, matching URLs within those directives. We do the best matching by number of characters. So that's something where if you have like a slash at the end of the URL or at the end of the directive, that can be another character and make it more specific. We don't explicitly look for folder names. So if you mention /folder as a directive, then that can also match /folder name /. So it's something where this part of the text is actually within here, so it would match. If you want to only match things that are in a specific folder, then you need to add like the trailing slash here. The directives here are case sensitive, so if you have a file, if it's in uppercase or lowercase, then depending on how that's blocked in the robot's text, it might or might not be indexed. Asterisk is a character we saw briefly here, and it matches any number of other characters. So in this case, it's essentially disallowing anything, and as long as it has /Europa/ at the end of that URL. or somewhere in between the URL. And the $sign matches the end of the URL. So if you explicitly want to match something that's right at the end of the URL, then you could use a $sign there.
John, if you can go back to the previous slide, since you're using a kind of a regex attempt there, so at the line disallow /star/Europa, does the star also include any other slashes that might be in between?
Yes.
Okay, so it might be /solar system / I don't know, Jupiter, I think, or is it Saturn? I'm not sure. /Europa.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, some of the things that we ignore in the robots text is usually we ignore the order, or we always ignore the order in the file. So you can order them in whatever order makes sense for you, makes it easier for you to read. I know some other robots text parsers look at the order and try to figure out which one is more relevant based on the order in the file, but from our point of view, we don't watch the order. We ignore any unknown directives. So, for example, crawl delay is something that some other search engines use. I believe Bing uses that. We ignore that. Also, if you have any other kind of random characters or anything that you forgot in the robots text file, we'll ignore that. The downside to this is also if you have a typo in the robots text file. So if you go back here and you have like allow with one L or without the A or something, or disallow maybe with a dash in it, then that's something where we would ignore that whole directive. We also ignore a single byte order mark for UTF files. So if you save a file in UTF format and you have the bomb at the beginning of the file, we'll ignore that. If you have two of them in the beginning of the file, then we'll assume that the second one was meant to be there kind of as a character within the file. So that might be something to watch out for. I haven't seen any issues with that in a really long time, though. Best practices is, as you can imagine, with the different orders of precedence within the file, try to keep it as simple as possible so that you can look at the robots text file and easily understand, is this specific URL blocked or not? We recommend using UTF-8 encoding in the file. You can also escape the URLs if you want. Sometimes that makes it a bit easier. One recommendation I have is to include some kind of a versioning information as a comment. So I did this in the example here, and that I mentioned this is for this domain, and maybe this change date when this file was changed. The reason I do that is because it makes it a lot easier to diagnose if something goes wrong. So if you accidentally push your developer server robots text file to your live server, or if you accidentally have some kind of a problem with your CDN that maybe the older version is being served and sometimes a newer version, with the version information as a comment, you can easily see which version of the file is being served here without reviewing the contents of the file completely. In robots, in Search Console, we have a robots text testing tool, which is really neat. It checks the validity of the robots text file to see if it kind of complies with the directives that you have. You can see the old versions of the file on top. So it says here latest version. You can click on this to get a drop down of the previous versions that we've seen, especially if there were changes within the robots text file. You can double check to see, is Googlebot always seeing the right version, or is it maybe swapping between two different versions, or was it the wrong version accidentally uploaded on Friday and left until Monday until when it was fixed again? So you can kind of double check that. You can also submit individual URLs to check them to see if they're crawlable, and you can directly edit this file. You can then download it, upload it to your server, and submit it. If you submit it with the robots text testing tool, then we'll pick that up essentially immediately. So you don't have to wait that extra cycle until the next day when we've recrawled the robots text file. So that can kind of help if you need to make urgent changes in the robots text file. Another neat tool we have in Search Console is the Blocked Resources tool. It shows you across your whole site which parts of the content is blocked by robots text. And that gives you a bit more insight into, are you blocking maybe specific CSS files that are used across your website? And the main reason why we give you this information is because if these files are blocked, then we can't use them for rendering. We can't use them for indexing either, so we can't see what content you're pulling in there. So we really recommend unblocking those resources as much as possible, especially if they add to your pages, be it design-wise or content-wise. So one reason we have that is we recently sent out a message to a lot of sites saying, we detected an issue in that we can't access your JavaScript or CSS files. And hey, what's up? Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually index your content properly? And the reason here is really because of embedded content on these pages that's blocking us from actually being able to view the whole page the way a browser would view it. So here's an example that I pulled up on where this can really be a problem. So this is, for example, a chain, I think, of restaurants or some chain of businesses that has locations in lots of places across the world, or at least across the US. And they use the Google Maps API to show the individual locations. So the addresses here, phone numbers. They have a tab for the opening hours where you can actually kind of click on that within Google Maps to get the opening hours for this individual location. And the problem here is that, at least when I last checked this, since it uses the Google Maps API and the Google Maps API is blocked by robots text, we can't actually pick up the individual locations of this business. We can't pick up the opening hours. We don't really know what to show in search if someone is searching for the specific business in this specific location, because we don't have that information at all. So that's something where embedded content that comes in from other websites and it's being blocked, where it does provide significant value to your page's content, to your business perhaps, is causing problems on your website. So that's something where it might be worth looking at your website to see if you have similar issues where you're pulling in content from other sources, be it with an API or JavaScript file or some kind of a shared server response, and where that content is actually blocked by robots text. So one idea that you could do here is kind of work around this limitation of the Google Maps API and also include these locations in static HTML on the page, also include the opening hours for these locations in static HTML so that we can crawl those pages, we can render them, we'll see the map that we can't actually crawl because it's blocked by robots text, but we'll find all of the content that is also shown in the map within the HTML. So that's kind of goes into this as well. A good way to check for embedded resources that are blocked is to use the Fetch as Google feature in Search Console. It'll tell you which of the embedded resources are blocked, and you can go through those resources and try to figure out, does this significantly affect the content or the design of the page? And if so, maybe contact the owner of that site to see if that can be unblocked. We'll probably be going out and try to reach out to some of the bigger sites that have content that's embedded on other people's sites so that we can kind of make that more easily crawlable and indexable. But you can also do that on your site, especially if you're working together with maybe a local business provider, local business directory that stores the opening hours for lots of businesses and pulls them in with JavaScript. If the content is from embedding, then we won't index it separately. So it's not that you have to fear that we'll crawl and index your CSS files and suddenly they'll rank for your company name. If we know that this content is just from embedding, we'll kind of just treat that as a part of what we use for rendering, but not for search indexing. And if you want to make sure that we don't index it, you can always use the xrobots tag HTTP header. There's some simple ways to apply that across a whole website and say, all of my CSS files I'll allow crawling, but block any indexing of them. All right, I think, yes, that's the end. You made it to the end. Wow, that was pretty long, actually. All right. Any questions to the presentation or any parts in there, anything specific? None yet? Okay.
Well, I have a few, but I was kind of wanted to give a chance to everybody else. Well, since no one is...
Go for it.
I was just... let me try to share something. Let me see if this works. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a problem that I've seen a lot of people on the product forums report. So the asterisk character, you said it matches any number of characters, but it only matches file names, not folders when you're talking about files. So as I've seen, if you have like disallow / Europa, the Europa folder, and you want to allow the JavaScript files inside Europa folder, you need the second allow line, not the first one wouldn't work, right?
Yes, but it's not because it's in a folder. It's because the second line is shorter. Like the asterisk.js is shorter than /Europa/.
Oh, so it's matching based on the number of the specificity, so the number of characters.
Yes, exactly.
I see. So the first allow line wouldn't basically allow every JavaScript folder on the server. If there's any, what if I delete this one and only leave it like this? Would this work?
Then it would disallow, or, well, it probably wouldn't do anything except for disallow or Europa, because all files are by default already allowed. And any JavaScript files within Europa would be disallowed because of the Europa directive. So it probably, the allow line there probably wouldn't do anything.
Okay, so it has to be like this to allow the JavaScript files inside the Europa folder.
Yes, exactly.
And one second question, is there any difference between these three, the first three allow lines?
The first two are equivalent, so we assume that URLs start with a / because they kind of have to, and the one with the $sign at the end means that it has to end with a .js. So sometimes we'll see things like versioning that you do with like a question mark and a parameter with a date or a kind of a version number. So you'll see, I don't know, styles.css question mark version equals whatever. And that wouldn't match, of course, if you have a $sign at the end.
So something like this you're referring to, that a lot of CMSs are kind of using now.
Exactly.
And what about this line? If I don't use the star sign,
then that's only URLs that start with .js.
Oh, okay.
Probably usually none, I would imagine.
Okay. Okay, that's about it. Thanks.
All right. Okay, otherwise I'll go through the questions that were submitted, and it doesn't look like we have tons of them, so we'll still have time for more questions if anything comes up along the way. Your guidelines say that Googlebot could not honor a disallow directive if a page contains a +1 button. Is this rule still valid? Are there other cases in which Googlebot would not respect a disallow directive? I don't think that rule is really in place. So the tricky part with the +1 button isn't so much that we would crawl the page, but rather that based on clicking the +1, the user or whoever is using the web page is telling us that they think this is a good page, and then we'll fetch that page using whatever Google Plus uses to fetch pages, and we'll pull out like the title and the description, the snippet, and show that on the user's +1's page, which is something that can get crawled and indexed. So essentially, it's not that we're crawling and indexing the page itself for search, but we're looking at the page based on the user's click, and we're pulling out the title and description and showing that on the user's page. So if someone is searching for that title or that description, then potentially that user's page with the listings of +1s could show up in search. So it's a bit of a tricky situation in the sense, kind of like if you disallow crawling of one page and someone else copies and pastes it to a different page, then obviously we don't really know that this is the same content, and we could be indexing the content that way. If example.com/robots_text is a 301 redirect to example.com, can it cause confusion to Google, or will Google just treat it as if there weren't any robots text file? We'll actually follow that redirect and see that it points at the home page, and if the home page is normal HTML, like most home pages are, I guess, then we won't find any relevant robots text directives on that page, and we won't find anything that we can use for the robots text. So in practice, we kind of ignore that from happening. Theoretically, you could think of a situation where someone puts robots text directives on their homepage, and we pick those up and we think, oh, this HTML page actually has content that matches the robots text, and the robots text file redirects there, so we could pick that up for crawling and indexing. You can also 301 redirect to a different domain. For example, if you're moving your site from one domain to another, you would redirect your robots text file, and then we would take the final robots text file that we end up on as a robots text file. Following up to, I guess, a different question, if I disallow the folder in which my CSS and JavaScript files sit, but allow .js and CSS files, won't Googlebot still honor the disallow, as you always honor the most restrictive option if there are any contradictions? This is kind of like Mihai's example, in the sense that we look at the most specific match that matches the directives and the URLs that we're trying to crawl. So it's not that we look at the most restrictive one, but rather that we look at the most specific one. As a follow-up to another question, if index pages become blocked in robots text, are they ever dropped from the index? Or do they need to be recrawled to read a no-index tag to de-index them? If an index page becomes blocked by robots text, then usually what will happen is we'll drop the information that we have from previous crawls, and we won't use that for search, for crawling, indexing, and, well, for indexing and ranking. So we would kind of lose the information that we used to have there, and we just index the URL, maybe with that generic snippet that we don't know what this page is about. But sometimes that also means that we just drop them from search completely if we think, well, this URL, without any additional information that we'd have about it, without any links pointing to that URL, doesn't really have any context that we could use for ranking anyway, so maybe we'll drop that from search. So they could theoretically be dropped from search, but it's not guaranteed. On the other hand, if you add a no-index tag to those pages and you allow crawling so that we can look at the no-index tag, then that does tell us explicitly you don't want this page indexed at all, and then we'll drop that from search essentially the next time we process that URL properly.
Can somebody use the remove URL tool if the robots text is disallowing that?
Yes. So you can use the public removal tool if something is blocked by robots text. It'll be removed, I think, for 90 days from search. But it's something where if you use the public tool, you have to do that on a per URL basis. So you can't say, oh, everything in this folder should be removed from search. It would have to be on a per URL basis. And if this is your website and you use the tool within Search Console, then you can say anything on your website should be removed from search, and it doesn't have to be blocked. It doesn't have to have a no index on it. We'll essentially trust your input and say, well, you said you're the owner of this website, and if you don't want this index, then fine, we'll take that out of search. That's also removed, I believe, for 90 days, and then if we recrawl it and actually do find content there, we'll bring that back in search. Which one is recommended method to block a page? Robots text or meta no index tag? Sometimes we see a page is blocked in robots, but still crawlable due to index follow command. So in order for us to see the robots meta tag, we have to crawl the page first. So if a page is blocked by robots text, then we won't know what the robots meta tags are. We won't know if it says allow crawl, allow indexing, or don't allow indexing. We can't know about that. We can't guess that, essentially. So if you have something specific in your meta tags that you want Google to follow, make sure that we can actually crawl that page so that we can see that content. So in that sense, the robots text kind of overrides any meta tags in that if we can't crawl, we don't know what's there, we can't follow those meta tags. I got a warning for a bomb yesterday, so this is for the Unicode-based files. I believe we only show that in the testing tool so that you're aware of that, but it's not something that would block processing of the robots text file. How to give access to crawl JavaScript and CSS files in the robots text file. We looked at that briefly before with Mihai's great example, in the sense that you generally look at where those files are hosted and why they're blocked. A really interesting way to find out why they're blocked is to use a robots text testing tool. You can enter the URL on the bottom that you want to have checked for your site, and it'll highlight which line is actually blocking that URL from being crawled. So that makes it a little bit easier to figure out where you need to kind of make adjustments in your robots text file. When will you parse a robots text file with BOM properly? Most end users don't understand the niceties of ASCII versus UTF-8. Yeah, like I mentioned before, we do follow robots text files if they have one big BOM mark within the file, so in the beginning of the file. But if you have two of them, then that's something that is essentially not a part of the, I guess, the spec, and we would think that the second one is actually part of your content. But one of them is fine. We should be able to handle that perfectly. Wow, made it through all the questions. Let's see what we have in chat. Nothing crazy. All right, more time for you all.
I wanted to, so this Hangout is specifically ask away about robots until the end of the hour, or can we ask anything else?
Let's see if we have more robots text questions first, or robots meta tags.
Okay.
I gotta, but I'll let Claire go ahead.
Thanks so much. John, one of our clients has added a crawl delay in the robots file. What is it used for? Can we still use it, or should we take it out of the robots file?
What did they add again? I didn't understand that.
A crawl delay.
Crawl delay. Okay, that's something that I believe other search engines might use. We ignore that. So that's essentially a line that tells the search engine or the search engines that support it that they should wait so many seconds between individual crawls of a URL. But we've noticed that most sites, when they implement this, implement it in a very broken way that would actually prevent crawling of a lot of their websites. So we tend not to use that information. I don't think we use it at all. And I don't think we've ever really used that.
Perfect, great.
Hey, John. We have a web page which is blocked in the robots.txt, but that page has highly got backlinks from affiliate websites. So in this case, like, will Google consider robots and then index the page, or it just straight away come and index it because of no index meta tag?
So in a case like that, it's very likely that we would index the URL. We wouldn't be able to crawl it, of course. We wouldn't see what's actually on this page, but we'll see based on the links to that page, which anchor text was used. We can use some of that for a title that we can show in search. We can use some of that to kind of figure out where we should rank this page. Is this a really important page, or is this just one of the million other pages that we've seen that are blocked by robots text? So it's not guaranteed that we would index it like that, but it's, I'd say, very likely.
Okay, and if the same pattern is blocked in URL parameter and Webmaster, so how Google treats, like, is it robots, no index, URL, or what is the priority order?
The parameter handling tool essentially is a signal for us. It's not a directive that would say we always must follow the directive, the information in the parameter handling tool, but rather you're saying, oh, Google, this is probably not that important. You can probably skip this. And we might still look at those URLs. We might still double check to see if we're missing anything, but it's not a complete block like the robots text would be.
Okay. Thank you.
So if you have any errors in the sitemap, does that impact the ranking?
Errors in the sitemap, not really. So the sitemap file would tell us which URLs exist on your website, which ones have recently been changed or added. And if you have errors in the sitemap file, then obviously we won't get that additional information. So maybe we won't be able to pick up the new or the changed URLs that quickly, but it's not that your website as a whole would rank differently because of errors in the sitemap.
Okay.
Okay, I'll go ahead now. Okay, first of all, do you take into account anything other than the, I don't know, anchor text of links when you're trying to decide whether you should rank a page that's blocked by robots.txt for a certain query? Anything else you can?
I think we really mostly look into like the anchor text of the links, the type of the links that we find for those pages. Sometimes what we'll find, for example, is that government sites might not be hosted on a very strong server, and they might say, oh, well, Googlebot provides an extra load on our server, and we don't want that, so they'll block individual pages, or maybe the whole site from being crawled. But that's still a very important site for us, so we still need to be able to figure that out and to kind of show that in search.
Okay, but you can't really be more specific about what do you take into account, just as long as there's nothing on the page. So it's not like you will just take the title meta tag but not look at what's in the body content.
No. I mean, if we can't crawl it, we can't look at the content of the page. So that's something where if you see Googlebot crawling something that's blocked by robots text, then that would be a really critical bug on our side, and that shouldn't be happening. So that's something that the Googlebot team takes really seriously. They probably wake someone up and say, hey, you need to double check what's happening here. Most of the cases where we've seen that happening are actually situations where the webmaster did something wrong, where the wrong robots text file was suddenly visible, those kind of things. But we take that really seriously if Googlebot were to like peek at a page and say, well, I won't use this for indexing, but let me just peek at the page's content and maybe use some of it for ranking.
Just to make sure. But do you also take into account internal links? So do you also look at internal links at the site?
Sure.
The anchor text is like just here or click here. What will you show in the title tag in the results?
Probably click here. I mean, you can try this out. I'm sure there are pages that are ranking like that, where the content is blocked from crawling, and we just rank it for some terrible anchor text where we don't really have that much more information. So that I'm sure there are lots of pages like that.
John, I
go ahead.
I wanted to ask about a server issue because we touched on it a couple hangouts ago. So if I have a server issue where a client is on a shared server, and it's still a reliable host, and it's basically the server hasn't been working, the past 24 hours, and so the page is no longer there. And then I fetch it again, right? That causes a ranking problem, right? Because because it happened to a client where the hosting wasn't working correctly, and the site was on page 1, number 6, and now it's on the second page, number 5.
Hard to say. So, in general, if we can't reach the server, then we can't get the robots text file, and we won't crawl anything else from the site. So that's kind of also an extra protection in that if your server goes down and we can't reach the robots text file, we're not going to hammer the server even more to try to get that content, because if we can't get the robots text file, we won't be able to look at it anyway. So that's kind of something that might be happening there. With regards to ranking, usually that's more of an indirect effect. So I don't believe we take into account any kind of server errors that happen on a website when it comes to ranking, because this is kind of a technical problem that can happen to all websites. It doesn't mean that the website is less relevant for a user. But there might be indirect effects there. So if a large part of your website is dropped from search because we can't crawl it anymore, then obviously we won't be able to follow those internal links to the rest of your content, and we won't be able to rank that properly. And it might be that it does drop in ranking a little bit because we kind of lose track of the context of that individual page. But as we can recrawl and re-index the rest of the pages that were blocked or that were dropped, then that should pick up automatically. It's not something that lingers on where Googlebot has a grudge because your server went down.
Okay, what do you think Googlebot likes more, the meta tag or the actual file? What's better to use?
For what?
Having the meta robots file, or just having an actual meta tag on the actual page? Is it better to have it in the server or in the
actual... So with regards to like the no index?
Yeah, no index, no follow.
No index, no follow. Well, we don't use that in the robots text, so from that point of view, it's always on the page. But you can put it into the HTTP header. That's an option. Essentially, with the robots meta tags, we handle it a little bit differently than the robots text file does. So with the robots meta tags, we look at the most restrictive one, and we follow that. So if you have, for example, index follow in your HTTP headers for the X robots tag, and you have no index, no follow in the robots meta tag, then the more restrictive one will trump the less restrictive one there.
Okay. No, it's just because there's also global, if the site is, if there's other search engines around the world that still use that. So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
Okay.
We used to support the no index directive in the robots text kind of as an experimental feature, but it's something that I wouldn't rely on, and I don't think other search engines are using that at all.
Okay.
Is there any difference between using the robots text file and using a no-follow attribute or rel no-follow attribute on a certain link?
Well, the robots text file prevents us from crawling that page at all, and the no index, no follow just means that for that specific page, any links don't pass PageRank. So it's kind of similar in the sense that we won't be able to get there, but just because that one page has a no follow on it doesn't mean that we don't find any other pages that have like a PageRank passing link.
Right, but assuming that is the only page that links to a certain page, it would really have the same effect. You won't be able to get to that page.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like if you have a rel no follow on an individual link, and that link is the only link leading to that page, then it's a similar situation where maybe we would know about this link, this URL, and we could index it separately, but we don't have any signals that we can associate with it. So it's not really going to show up in search.
Okay. One last thing. This is since we talked a lot about crawling, what would you say is a good architecture for a site to have so that the crawling is as efficient as possible, and Google doesn't waste its crawl budget on like something that's not really important.
Anything where you have clean links between the pages and where you don't have multiple URLs leading to the same piece of content. I think those are essentially the main things that really help us there, in the sense that we can follow those links really easily, we can find all of the content, and we don't run across a lot of duplication that we have to drop in the end.
I'm assuming that
is key, right?
Sorry?
Good navigation is key.
Yeah, I mean, that's the internal linking within the website. That really helps us to kind of find all of the content and understand its context a little bit better. So this shoe is within this section of men's shoes or blue shoes or whatever, and then we kind of understand the context of that page based on the internal linking.
Right, but I assume it's not really good to have like you have a 100-page website, but it takes like 7 or 8 clicks to get from the main page to one of the other pages. A flat architecture is usually better than something that runs really deep.
I think you'd probably focus more on the user side there, on the user experience side, where anything that's easy to find for the user is something that's more useful for them. So from that point of view, those two kind of goals kind of align really well, and that if you think about the user, then chances are you'll probably get it right for the search engines too.
Okay, and since I'm working with a lot of e-commerce websites, and e-commerce websites usually focus on having some sort of faceted navigations with a lot of filters, and the combination of filters sometimes creates a lot of extra pages that aren't really useful for the user to find in search results, for example, especially if the e-commerce site already has some good landing page or categories that already help the user. So you might have a 1,000-page website, but the filters create another 50,000 pages. Would you recommend to better go with the robust.txt, or maybe no index or canonicalize those pages? What would be your best approach?
I'd rather try to use no index, rel canonical, no follow to kind of prevent that. The thing with using robots text for canonicalization is that whenever we find links to those pages, any of the page rank that we would pass through that link is essentially lost. So it goes to a URL that's blocked by robots text. We have no idea what it is. We don't know if it's a duplicate, if we can match that. And it's essentially lost. So if someone externally links to those pages, that link doesn't really help your website. Or if you do that internally, and you say, well, all the great shoes are in this section for special deals for blue shoes for men, that's something that essentially gets lost. So with canonicalization, with no follow links, no index, all of that really helps us to understand, okay, this page we can crawl. We see it's a duplicate of an existing page that we have. Therefore, we can fold all the links into that version that we do keep and kind of really help the site in that way. Whereas if it's blocked by robots text, we have no idea what it is. We don't really know what to do with that link.
Okay, so as long as it's not really excessive in the amount of extra pages you're creating with the filters, canonicalization or no indexing those pages is a better approach.
Yes, definitely.
So I've been advising my clients well.
Yeah, John, so if a page has no index follow and that has a canonical pack to third-party page, the purpose of that is to ensure that, follow from here, but credit back whatever the value it has to a different page. Google understands that pattern, like no index follow and follow the canonical.
So that's, I think, a special situation. In that case, what we would practically do is just follow that canonical and use that. But the tricky part there is that with the canonical, you're telling us these pages are equivalent. And if actually one of them pages is indexable, the other page is no index, then they're really not equivalent at all. So that's something where you're kind of giving us conflicting information. You're saying these pages are exactly the same, but actually this page is very different because it should be indexed, and this one shouldn't be indexed at all. So as much as possible, I'd really recommend being as clear as possible with the directives and say this is indexable, this isn't indexable, this is indexable and has a canonical pointing at a different page.
Yeah, I think the situation comes because of some copyright issues, such link effects in Google, right? So we are ranking really good, but because of that copyright issue raised up, so we thought to ensure that we want to pass all the juice from here to page B, but at the same time remove from the Google index as per the copyright issue.
Yeah, I try not to combine those two.
Yeah, makes sense. Also, one thing, so for the apps, right? So we still use the same what it has on the mobile robots or on the web robots.
For apps,
yeah,
I think we do that on a hostname basis. So depending on which hostname you have linked or used for embedded content, we would do it on that.
Okay. It's particularly like M-site, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
John, by the way, your competitor does support robots meta-tags.
Well, robots meta tags in the robots text file, or
no index, no follow.
Well, those are meta tags. Yeah, we do that.
Okay, so I can just place it on the home page.
Sure.
Okay.
All right. With that, we're just out of time. Thank you all for dropping by. Thanks for wading through my presentation. I hope you found it interesting, and maybe we'll see some of you again in one of the future Hangouts. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Okay,
Bye, everyone.
thanks, John.
Bye, John.